Imagine a world not so different from our own in its physical form, yet unimaginably empty of human presence. The great continents of Earth, from the vast savannas of Africa to the sprawling plains of Eurasia, teem with life, but a specific, familiar voice is missing from the chorus. This is not the world of the dinosaurs, separated from us by tens of millions of years. This is a chapter in our own story, a mere 900,000 years ago, a chapter that was almost erased, a whisper in the deep time of our lineage, that was nearly silenced forever. For much of human history, our understanding of our own past was fragmented, pieced together from scattered fossils and stone tools, telling a story of a slow but steady march from primitiveness to civilization. It was a linear narrative, or so we thought. But science, in its relentless pursuit of truth, has a way of uncovering deeper, more complex, and often more dramatic tales. In recent years, a startling discovery has begun to reshape our origin story, not through the unearthing of a new hominin species, but through the reading of a code hidden within every single one of us, our DNA. Advanced genomic detective work has revealed a profound secret etched into the very fabric of our genes. It is the genetic memory of a catastrophe, an event of such staggering magnitude that it brought the entire human species to the brink of absolute extinction. The evidence suggests that around 900,000 years ago, our ancestral population was reduced to a tiny band of survivors, perhaps no more than 1,280 breeding individuals. This was not a local event. It was a global population collapse that lasted for over 100,000 years. A desperate struggle for existence in the face of an overwhelming crisis. 99% of our ancestral family was wiped out. This narrative is the story of that bottleneck. It is a journey back to that precipice. We will explore the world as it was then, a world of climatic upheaval and ferocious megafauna. We will meet our ancestors, not as primitive brutes, but as resilient, intelligent beings facing an existential threat. We will examine the cutting-edge science that allowed us to discover this near oblivion, reading the faint echoes of trauma in our genome. We will investigate the possible causes of this great dying. Was it a dramatic shift in climate, a supervolcanic eruption, the relentless pressures of a changing world? And most importantly, we will follow the arduous path of the survivors, the few who persevered through the long winter and whose determination ultimately led to the peopling of the entire planet, giving rise to every human being alive today. This is a tale of catastrophe and survival, of immense loss and incredible fortitude. It is the story of our deepest crisis, a forgotten winter that shaped the course of human evolution and made us who we are today. The silence of that empty world was long and deep, but from it, eventually, emerged a sound that would one day transform the earth, the enduring voice of humanity, born from the brink. To understand the catastrophe that nearly erased us, we must first paint a vivid portrait of the world our ancestors called home. The Earth of 900,000 years ago was a dynamic and often brutal planet, a world both familiar and profoundly alien. This was the Pleistocene epoch, often dubbed the Ice Age, a period defined by its dramatic climatic oscillations. But this was not the world of the last glacial maximum, with its massive ice sheets covering much of Europe and North America. That was still far in the future. This was an earlier, yet critically important, phase of planetary change. The climate of this era was characterized by a powerful and increasingly erratic pulse. The planet was swinging through cycles of glacial periods often called ice ages in popular parlance, and shorter, warmer interglacial periods. These cycles were driven by subtle variations in Earth's orbit and tilt, known as Milankovitch cycles, which altered the distribution and intensity of solar radiation reaching the planet's surface. But around the time of our bottleneck, the rhythm of these cycles seems to have changed. The pulse became slower, the glacial periods longer and more severe, the interglacials shorter. The world was, in a sense, tightening its grip, becoming a colder, drier, and more unpredictable place. The geography of the continents was largely modern, but with crucial differences shaped by the immense amount of water locked away in expanding polar ice caps. Global sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, by as much as 100 meters or more. This exposed vast stretches of continental shelf, creating land bridges that became highways and traps for life. The most famous of these, the Bering Land Bridge, connected Asia and North America, but others were equally important. Islands were joined to mainlands, and Indonesia was a sprawling extension of Southeast Asia, a region known as Sutland. In Africa, the cradle of humanity, The environment was undergoing a profound transformation. The stable, warm, and humid conditions that had supported vast forests were giving way to something new and challenging. The climate was becoming drier and more seasonal. Lush woodlands were receding, replaced by open savannas, grasslands, and scrubby mosaics. This expansion of open landscapes was a double-edged sword for our hominin ancestors. It offered new opportunities, the ability to see predators from a distance, new game to hunt, new environments to exploit, but it also came with immense costs. Sources of water became scattered and unreliable. Shelter from the relentless sun was harder to find. The very fabric of the ecosystem was shifting. This was a world dominated by megafauna, creatures of immense size and power that would seem fantastical to us today. Mammoths and mastodons, with their long, curved tusks, were the giants of the northern grasslands and forests. In Eurasia, the steppes were patrolled by the woolly rhinoceros, a formidable beast clad in thick fur. Saber-toothed cats, with their deadly, elongated canines, were apex predators in many regions. Giant ground sloths, some the size of modern elephants, browsed on vegetation in the Americas. Africa was home to its own unique cast of megafauna, including giant buffalo, numerous species of large antelope, and formidable predators like the massive short-faced hyena and the saber-toothed Anopheles, a potential hunter of hominins. For our ancestors, these animals represented both the larder and the mortal danger. A successful hunt could feed a group for days, but an encounter with the wrong creature could mean instant death. Into this world of changing climates and giant beasts walked our ancestors. They were not Homo sapiens. Our species would not evolve for another 800,000 years. The most likely candidate for our direct lineage at this time is Homo heidelbergensis, or a very similar, immediate ancestor. These were tall, robust people, with brains larger than those of their Homo erectus forebears, approaching almost 3/4 the size of our own. They were master toolmakers, crafting sophisticated hand axes and cleavers from stone. Tools so symmetrical and refined that they are considered works of technological art, the Achillean industry. They were hunters, capable of bringing down large game, and they were social beings, living in bands, likely with complex communication skills, though not yet full modern language. They were a successful species, and their success is evidenced by their spread. From their evolutionary heartland in East Africa, populations of Homo heidelbergensis had begun to radiate outward. They had moved into North Africa, into the challenging environments of the Middle East, and, most significantly, had begun to push into the temperate and often cold landscapes of southern Europe and Asia. They were on the cusp of becoming a truly global species, a pioneer exploring every corner of the Old World. But this world of opportunity was also a world of fragility. Their populations, while widespread, were undoubtedly thin on the ground. They lived intimately connected to their environment, their survival contingent on knowing the migration patterns of herds, the location of fresh water sources, and the best stone for their tools. Their social networks were likely local, with bands interacting over limited territories. They were resilient, but their existence was balanced on a knife's edge. They had built a foothold on the world, but that world was becoming increasingly unstable. The stage was set, the pressures were building. The great climatic engine of the Earth was shifting into a new and more dangerous gear, and our ancestors, for all their ingenuity and strength, were about to be caught in the vortex of a planetary upheaval that would push them to the very brink of annihilation. The long winter was approaching. For centuries, the only clues to humanity's deep past were the tangible ones, fragments of bone and stone tools buried in the earth. These fossils told a story, but it was a story with immense gaps, like a book with most of its pages ripped out. The true revolution in understanding our origins did not come from the soil, but from within ourselves. It began with the unlocking of the human genome, the intricate code of life carried in every cell, a historical document of unparalleled richness. It is within this biological archive that scientists discovered the ghost of an ancient catastrophe, the unmistakable signature of a population collapse, so severe it left a permanent scar on our DNA. The science that allows us to read this ancient history is known as population genetics. Its fundamental premise is that genetic mutations accumulate in a population over time at a relatively steady rate. By analyzing the diversity within modern human DNA, geneticists can work backwards. Using complex mathematical models and powerful computers, to infer the demographic history of our species. It is a process akin to listening to an echo. The strength and pattern of the returning sound can tell you about the size and shape of the cavern it came from. The genetic diversity we see in humans today is the echo, and it points to a very small cavern in our past. The key evidence for the bottleneck lies in two particular types of genetic analysis. The first involves the study of ALU sequences. These are short, repetitive stretches of DNA that insert themselves at random into the genome at a very low but constant rate. Once inserted, they are rarely lost. They are, in effect, genetic fossils that mark a point in time. By comparing the number and placement of these ALU sequences across thousands of people from diverse populations, scientists can estimate the size of the ancestral population at the time these insertions occurred. The stunning finding was that the number of these sequences shared by all modern humans is remarkably low, suggesting the ancestral population from which we all sprang was very small. The second, and perhaps more powerful line of evidence, comes from studying linkage disequilibrium. This complex term describes the tendency for certain genes or genetic markers to be inherited together more often than would be expected by chance. Over many generations, the natural process of recombination where parental chromosomes mix and match during the creation of sperm and eggs breaks apart these linked segments. The rate of this breakdown is predictable. When scientists looked at the human genome, they found vast blocks of DNA that were still linked together, far larger than would be expected given our assumed population size over the last million years. The only plausible explanation for such large, unbroken blocks of linked genes is a severe and prolonged reduction in population. In a tiny population, genetic diversity plummets, and recombination has less variety to work with, preserving these long-linked sequences for thousands of generations. The size of these blocks pointed directly to a bottleneck starting around 900,000 years ago and lasting for over 100,000 years. The conclusions drawn from this genetic evidence are staggering. The model suggests that the effective population size, the number of breeding individuals of our ancestral lineage, shrank to approximately 1,280 people. It is crucial to understand that this does not mean only 1,280 humans were alive on the entire planet. It means that the genetic diversity that was passed down to every human alive today funnels through this tiny group. There may have been other isolated populations of hominins elsewhere, perhaps in West Africa or in parts of Arsabut. If they existed, their lineage died out. They left no genetic legacy in modern humans. We are all descendants of that single, incredibly resilient band of survivors. This genetic bottleneck was not a brief event. The data indicates that our ancestors lived in this perilous state for generation after generation, perhaps for over 100,000 years. That is a span of time longer than all of recorded human history, a terrifyingly long period of isolation and vulnerability. For millennia, the entire future of humanity hung by the thinnest of threads, vulnerable to a single drought, a single disease, a single shift in the migratory patterns of the animals they depended on. The fact that we are here today is a testament not to inevitability, but to fortune and incredible tenacity. This discovery fundamentally rewrites our story. It moves us from a narrative of steady expansion and progress to one of catastrophic near extinction and miraculous recovery. It adds a profound depth to our understanding of human evolution, revealing that our existence is not a given, but the result of a narrow escape from oblivion. The genetic evidence gives us the when and the how severe, but it begs the next, crucial question. What could have possibly caused such a devastating collapse? What force of nature was powerful enough to push a successful, widespread species like Homo heidelbergensis to the very edge of the abyss? The search for that answer leads us from the inner world of ourselves to the outer world of ancient climates and geological cataclysms. The genetic evidence is clear and unequivocal. Our species passed through an evolutionary eye of a needle, but a mystery of such magnitude demands an explanation. What could have caused a widespread, adaptable, and technologically sophisticated hominin population to collapse so dramatically? The answer is unlikely to be a single, simple event. Instead, it was most probably a perfect storm of multiple interconnected crises that converged around 900,000 years ago, each one exacerbating the other, until the pressure became too great for all but a tiny fortunate fraction of our ancestors to withstand. The primary suspect, and the one with the most evidence, is climate change. But this was not the gradual warming we discuss today. This was climate change on a monumental, planetary scale, characterized by extreme volatility and a sharp shift towards colder, drier conditions. The Earth's climate has always oscillated, but around the time of the bottleneck, the rhythm of these oscillations changed. For our ancestors, this meant environmental catastrophe. In Africa, the engine of human evolution, the already trend towards aridity, accelerated dramatically. The lush forests that had once covered much of the continent continued to retreat, fragmenting into isolated pockets. The vast savannas expanded, but they too changed, becoming drier, less productive, and more like the arid scrublands we see in some parts of Africa today. Crucially, fresh water, the absolute necessity for life, became scarce. Rivers shrank to trickles or vanished entirely. Great lakes, like those in the East African Rift Valley, the very cradle of humanity, receded, their basins turning into salt flats or dusty grasslands. The once reliable patterns of rainfall broke down, leading to prolonged and devastating droughts. The hominin population, scattered across the landscape, would have found itself trapped in a series of shrinking oases, cut off from one another by impassable arid barriers. Populations became isolated, genetic exchange ceased, and local extinctions became commonplace. This climatic upheaval would have triggered a cascade of secondary effects. The megafauna our ancestors relied upon for food would have also suffered. Large herbivores like giant antelope and prehistoric horses require vast amounts of vegetation and water. As the landscapes dried out, their populations would have crashed or been forced to migrate enormous distances to find sustenance, following unpredictable new routes. For a hunter-gatherer society, this meant the loss of a reliable food source. A band might track a herd for days, only to find the animals had moved far beyond their reach, or simply died out. The scarcity of resources would have inevitably led to increased competition, not just between different hominin groups, but with other formidable predators: lions, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, who were also desperate and hungry. The world became a place of scarcity, conflict, and immense struggle. While climate provides the overarching backdrop, a second, more dramatic culprit has been proposed: a massive volcanic eruption. The Earth's geological record shows evidence of truly cataclysmic volcanic events, known as supereruptions, which can eject thousands of cubic kilometers of ash and gas into the atmosphere. One such eruption occurred around this time, though pinpointing an exact date is challenging. The ash from a supereruption can blanket entire continents, smothering vegetation and poisoning water sources. But the real global killer is the immense volume of sulfur dioxide gas released, which transforms into sulfate aerosols in the upper atmosphere. These aerosols reflect sunlight back into space, triggering a volcanic winter that can last for years, or even decades. The immediate effects would have been apocalyptic. Skies would have darkened globally. Temperatures would have plummeted, even in the tropics. Photosynthesis would have ground to a near halt, causing the collapse of food chains from the bottom up. Rains would have become acidic. For a species already stressed by increasing aridity, a volcanic winter would have been a knockout blow. It would have shattered the remaining fragile ecosystems, wiping out the plant and animal life that hominins depended on. If such an eruption occurred, it could have been the final, devastating push that isolated the last surviving groups and pushed the global population below the sustainable threshold. It is also possible that a combination of these factors was to blame. An already stressed population, fragmented and struggling due to long-term climate trends, would have had no resilience left to withstand a sudden, short-term shock like a The perfect storm scenario is compelling. Long-term aridification created a vulnerable, fragmented population, and then a volcanic winter delivered the coup de grace, wiping out the isolated pockets one by one until only a single, resilient population remained. Where was this last refuge? Where did the final 1,000 and change hold on against the end of the world? Genetic and paleoclimatic data point strongly to a single, likely location, a region that maintained a stable and habitable environment, while the rest of the world, and particularly the rest of Africa, became inhospitable. All evidence suggests this sanctuary was in southern Africa. Geological records indicate that while East Africa was experiencing severe droughts, parts of southern Africa, particularly areas closer to the coast, may have maintained more reliable sources of water and a more stable climate due to different weather patterns and ocean currents. Here, in a land of refugia, our ancestors endured, They clung to life in a small corner of the world, their numbers so low that their footsteps, their campsites, their very existence, became virtually invisible in the archaeological record. For over 100 millennia, they were not the masters of the earth, but its most endangered species, living in the shadow of extinction, waiting for the world to change again. For over 100,000 years, the thread of human existence was frayed to its absolute limit. This was not a single event, a dramatic disaster that struck and then passed. It was an epoch, a geological age of hardship that stretched across thousands of generations. The world our bottlenecked ancestors inhabited was a world shrunken, impoverished, and silent. Theirs was a life defined not by expansion or innovation, but by pure, unadulterated survival. The genetic evidence gives us the stark numbers, but to understand their experience, we must use our imagination, informed by the fragments of evidence we have, to step into this long winter. The most immediate consequence of their drastically reduced numbers was social and genetic isolation. Imagine a world where a young person might live their entire life without ever encountering a human outside of their own immediate band. The comforting idea of a wider community, of potential mates from other groups, of trade in exotic materials or shared knowledge across a network, all of this vanished. Their social world became terrifyingly small. The loss of genetic diversity meant increased inbreeding, with all the associated health risks that brings. But perhaps more profoundly, the cultural world would have shrunk as well. Songs, stories, techniques for tool-making, knowledge of distant lands and animal migrations, a vast library of cultural information, built up over hundreds of thousands of years, was likely lost. With so few people to carry it, and with each generation focused solely on the brutal business of staying alive, cultural amnesia would have set in. They became victims of what anthropologists call a cultural bottleneck, where the richness and complexity of their society was stripped down to only the most essential elements. Their technology, as reflected in the scarce archaeological record from this period, appears to have stagnated. The beautifully crafted, symmetrical hand axes of the Acheulean tradition, which required skill, time, and confidence to produce, become rarer. In their place, we see simpler, more expedient tools, sharp flakes quickly struck from a core, used for an immediate task, and then discarded. This is not a sign of stupidity, but of practice. When every day is a struggle to find food and water, when your group is too small to station lookouts for long periods, you cannot afford to sit for hours meticulously shaping a perfect hand axe. You need a cutting tool, now. Their toolkit became one of desperation and efficiency, a reflection of a society living moment to moment. Their diet would have become drastically less specialized. Before the bottleneck, groups of Homo heidelbergenses were capable hunters of large game. But hunting a giant antelope or a prehistoric horse is a risky, coordinated endeavor that requires a certain number of able-bodied individuals. It also requires that such large game exists in huntable numbers. In their isolated refuge, our ancestors likely lost this capability. Their survival almost certainly shifted to a much broader, less glamorous diet. They would have become supreme generalists, exploiting every conceivable calorie source, gathering tubers, nuts and berries, scavenging the kills of other predators, hunting small game like rabbits, tortoises and birds, and foraging along coastlines for shellfish, a resource that is highly nutritious and crucially predictable. This shift in diet may have been key to their survival, as it allowed them to exploit a wider range of ecological niches without relying on the large, vanished herds. Life in the refuge was a constant calculation of risk and reward. A single broken leg from a fall, a difficult childbirth, a bite from a venomous snake, a sustained drought that dried up the last known waterhole. Any of these mundane tragedies, which a larger population could absorb, could have meant the end for an entire band. They lived with the constant, unspoken knowledge that they were the last. The weight of that knowledge, if they were indeed conscious of their isolation, is unimaginable. Yet, within this story of loss and deprivation, we must also see the seeds of incredible resilience. The very fact that they survived is a testament to their behavioral flexibility, their intelligence, and their profound social cohesion. In such a small group, cooperation was not a strategy. It was the only possible way to exist. Sharing food, caring for the injured and the young, standing watch through the dangerous night, these bonds would have been strengthened to an incredible degree. They had to become the most cooperative, most empathetic, most communicative group that had ever existed, because any internal conflict could doom them all. The social and emotional capacities that define us today, our deep need for connection, our ability to read the emotions of others, our impulse to care for the weak may have been forged and refined in the crucible of this long winter. The pressure to understand each other, to coordinate perfectly, to express complex ideas about past dangers and future plans, may have provided the selective pressure that pushed their proto-language into something more sophisticated. They were not just waiting for the world to get better. They were adapting in the most profound ways possible to a world that was at its worst. They were waiting, season after season, generation after generation. They watched the skies for signs of rain, tracked the slow return of game, and nurtured their tiny flame of culture and community. They were the guardians of the future, though they could not know it. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to change again. The grip of the Ice Age loosened. The rains returned to the African continent. The grasslands grew greener, and the rivers ran fuller. The long winter was finally, gradually, coming to an end. And when it did, the survivors emerged from their refuge, not as a conquering army, but as the grateful inheritors of an empty world, ready to begin again. The end of the long winter was not a sudden event, a switch flipped from Ice Age to warmth. It was a gradual, faltering process, a series of tentative steps towards a more stable and hospitable climate. The intense aridity that had gripped much of Africa, and particularly the refuge in the south, began to relent. The patterns of rainfall shifted, becoming more reliable, filling the dry riverbeds and recharging the aquifers. Vegetation returned to the barren landscapes, and with it, the animals followed the small, isolated bands of humans who had endured the long isolation. This change would have been perceptible over generations. It was a slow unlocking of the world, an opening of doors that had been sealed shut for 1,000 centuries. The genetic data shows a dramatic recovery. From the nadir of around 1,280 breeding individuals, the population began to expand, slowly at first, then with increasing speed and confidence. This was not a planned migration of conquest. It was a natural, organic process of a species filling an empty ecological niche. As resources became more abundant, groups could grow larger. Larger groups would then fission, a process where tensions or simply the opportunity would cause a faction to break away and move to a new territory, just over the next hill, across the next river, always seeking new sources of water, game, and stone for their tools. This emergence from the refuge was the second great migration in human history, and it would ultimately prove even more consequential than the first. The survivors, now genetically homogeneous but behaviorally supercharged by their ordeal, began to move out of their southern African stronghold. Their path was likely dictated by the returning greenery. They would have followed the game herds northwards, along the eastern coast of Africa where resources were plentiful, and into the heart of the continent they had once been forced to abandon. What they found was a world empty of their kind. The other hominin populations that may have existed outside the refuge in East Africa, in the northwest, in parts of Eurasia were gone, vanished during the long winter. They were stepping into a vacuum. This emptiness cannot be overstated. It meant there was no competition for territory from other intelligent, losing. The landscapes they entered were pristine, rich with untapped resources, and ripe for colonization. Every valley, every mountain range, every river system was a new frontier. This period of expansion also coincides with a significant technological and cognitive revolution in the archaeological record. As populations grew and came into more frequent contact with each other, ideas could once again be exchanged. The stagnation of the bottleneck gave way to a new burst of innovation. The most significant development was the mastery of fire. While evidence suggests earlier hominins may have used fire opportunistically, it is around this post-bottleneck period that we begin to find stronger evidence for the controlled, habitual use of fire. This was a technology that changed everything. Fire provided warmth, allowing groups to push into colder climates previously off. It provided protection, keeping predators at bay from campfires that illuminated the dangerous night. Most importantly, it provided a means to cook food. Cooking breaks down toxins and makes meat and tubers easier to digest, unlocking more calories and nutrients from their food and contributing to better health and, potentially, brain development. Their toolkits also became more sophisticated and varied. The simple, expedient flakes of the bottleneck era were supplemented and then replaced by a new technology, the Levallois technique. This was a prepared core technique, where a stone core was carefully shaped around the edges before a final, precise strike knocked off a pre-designed flake that was thin, sharp, and required minimal additional shaping. This was a leap in cognitive planning and foresight. It required the toolmaker to envision the final product inside the raw stone, and to execute a series of precise steps to achieve it. These tools were more efficient, and their production created more cutting edge from less stone, a crucial advantage for a mobile population, armed with new technologies, a more resilient social structure, and a world empty of competitors. The descendants of the bottleneck survivors spread with a speed and success that their ancestors could never have imagined. They moved north into the Middle East, a crossroads of continents. From there, they radiated outward in all directions. Some groups turned west, into Europe, where they would evolve into the Neanderthals, a robust species superbly adapted to the cold climates of the Ice Age. Other groups turned east, across the vast plains of Asia, some moving north into Siberia and others pushing south into the Indian subcontinent and all the way to the easternmost shores of the continent. They were no longer just survivors, they were pioneers. They were the common ancestors of all later hominins, including ourselves. Every Neanderthal, every Denisovan, every Homo sapiens that would ever walk the earth could trace their lineage back to that tiny, resilient group that had weathered the long winter in a southern refuge. The bottleneck had forged them into a new force, and they were now ready to claim their inheritance. The entire world. Their story of near extinction had become the prelude to a global conquest. The event that nearly ended us did not vanish without a trace. The genetic bottleneck of 900,000 years ago left an indelible mark on our species, a legacy etched into our very biology and perhaps even into the core of our behavior. The journey from the brink of extinction to a global species shaped who we are in profound and paradoxical ways, leaving us with both vulnerabilities and unique strengths that continue to influence humanity today. The most direct and measurable legacy is a lack of genetic diversity. Compared to many other primate species, such as chimpanzees, human genetic diversity is remarkably low. This is the direct echo of our population collapse. All the genetic variation that existed in the wider Homo heidelbergensis population was wiped out, save for the variation carried by that 1,000-strong group. We are, in a sense, clones when compared to our cousins in the animal kingdom. This genetic homogeneity has a significant consequence. It makes us more susceptible to certain genetic diseases, recessive mutations, which can be masked in a more diverse population, where an individual is unlikely to inherit two copies, became widespread in the small, inbred bottleneck population. When the population expanded, these mutations spread with it. Today, many inherited disorders, from cystic fibrosis to sickle cell anemia, are a tragic heirloom from our brush with extinction, a reminder of the time when our gene pool was at its shallowest. Yet, this same event may have also forged some of our greatest strengths. The intense pressure of living in small, isolated bands for over 100,000 years would have placed an enormous premium on social cohesion and cooperation. In a world where every individual was critical to the group's survival, traits that promoted group harmony and mutual aid would have been fiercely selected for. The ability to communicate complex ideas, to understand the intentions and emotions of others, a skill known as theory of mind, to share food and care for the sick and injured. These were not mere social niceties, they were essential survival strategies. It is possible that the bottleneck acted as a crucible, accelerating the evolution of the prosocial, hyper-cooperative, and communicative instincts that are the bedrock of human society. Our deep-seated need to belong, to form groups, and to help one another may have been hardened and refined during this long period of extreme adversity. Furthermore, the experience of the bottleneck may have selected for a particular kind of cognitive flexibility and resilience. The survivors were not the strongest or the most aggressive. They were the most adaptable. They were the ones who could shift their diet from large game to tortoises and tubers, who could innovate simple but effective tools quickly, and who could maintain social bonds under unimaginable stress. This plasticity, this ability to pivot and adapt to wildly changing circumstances, is a hallmark of our species. It is what allowed us to eventually colonize every continent on Earth. from the frozen Arctic to the arid deserts of Australia. The bottleneck may have weeded out rigidity and selected for a generalized intelligence that prized problem-solving and behavioral flexibility above all else. This legacy presents a profound paradox. Our species carries a genetic vulnerability, a monument to a time we almost disappeared. Yet, we also possess a stunning capacity for cooperation, innovation, and resilience. That seems directly linked to that same catastrophe. We are both fragile and mighty, a species whose greatest weaknesses and greatest strengths are intertwined, born from the same moment of extreme peril. The story of the bottleneck also forces us to confront our place in the natural world. It is a humbling narrative. It dismantles the idea of human exceptionalism as an inevitable, linear progression. Our existence is not a destined triumph, but a fortunate accident, a contingency. We are here not because we were predestined to rule the earth, but because a small group of our ancestors endured against impossible odds in a forgotten corner of Africa. It teaches us profound lessons about resilience, that survival often depends not on brute force, but on cooperation, adaptability, and the strength of social bonds. Finally, this ancient history holds a stark and urgent mirror to our present. Humanity now faces a new period of global environmental change, one of our own making. The lesson of the bottleneck is that climate change is not an abstract concept. It is a powerful force that has shaped our very existence and has nearly erased us before. It shows us that ecosystems are fragile, that resources can vanish, and that populations can collapse with terrifying speed. But it also shows us that we are the descendants of survivors. We carry within us the legacy of those who adapted, who cooperated, and who persevered through a long winter. The same traits that allowed us to survive then, our ingenuity, our sociality, our profound adaptability, are the tools we must now harness to navigate the challenges of the future. The echo of the bottleneck is a warning, but it is also a reminder of our deep and enduring capacity for resilience. We are a species born from catastrophe, and that origin story may hold the key to our continued survival. The discovery of the population bottleneck is not an endpoint. It is a magnificent beginning. It has thrown open the doors to a new era of scientific inquiry, transforming our understanding of human evolution from a relatively straightforward narrative into a complex, thrilling mystery filled with unanswered questions and tantalizing clues. Each piece of evidence we uncover, from a fragment of DNA to a stone tool buried in ancient sediments, seems to generate two new questions for every one it answers. The story of our near extinction is still being written, and the current chapters are among the most exciting in the entire saga of paleoanthropology. One of the most pressing and profound mysteries is the question of precise dating. The genomic evidence points compellingly to an event around 900,000 years ago, but the margin of error in these molecular clock calculations is still significant. Could it have been 800,000 years ago, or a million? Pinpointing the exact timing is critical, because it allows scientists to search the geological and paleoclimatological records for a specific trigger. Was there a supervolcanic eruption whose ash layer corresponds exactly to this date? Was there a particularly severe glacial onset that left its mark in ice core or ocean sediment data? Refining this timeline is a primary goal, requiring more sophisticated genomic analysis and, crucially, the discovery of more hominin fossils from this elusive period to provide anchor points for the genetic models. This leads directly to the second great mystery, the frustrating lack of fossil evidence. The period between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago is often called a ghost lineage in human evolution. The fossil record is incredibly sparse, almost silent. This absence is itself a powerful piece of evidence, corroborating the genetic story of a tiny, geographically restricted population, but it means we know shockingly little about the physical appearance and anatomy of our direct ancestors, who lived through the bottleneck. Were they classic Homo heidelbergensis, or were they a distinct, yet to-be-named variant? Finding fossils from this specific window of time, particularly in the proposed refuge areas of southern Africa, is the holy grail of this field. Each new discovery has the potential to put a face to our ancestors, and tell us more about how they lived and adapted. The geographical scope of the disaster is another area of active debate. Was the bottleneck truly a global event that affected all hominins everywhere? Or was it a regional catastrophe that primarily impacted the population in Africa that would later give rise to Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans? there is tantalizing, albeit controversial, evidence that some hominin populations, perhaps a different species of Homo, might have survived in places like China, outside of the main bottleneck. Did they interact with the expanding descendants of the African survivors later on? Unraveling this requires more archaeological work across Asia and Africa, searching for evidence of continuous occupation versus abandonment and recolonization. Furthermore, the cognitive and behavioral implications of the bottleneck are a rich field for speculation and research. Did this period of intense social pressure truly accelerate the development of complex language? Can we see evidence of this in the archaeological record through more complex tools or the first signs of symbolic behavior? How did their relationship with the environment change? Some theorists suggest that the necessity of exploiting a wide variety of lower quality food sources, like tubers, may have driven the development of more advanced digging tools or food processing techniques. The quest is to find material evidence: a campsite, a butchery site, a toolkit that speaks to the daily life and ingenuity of these desperate survivors. Finally, the story forces us to look outward and consider our place in the cosmos. The hypothesis of a supervolcanic eruption as a potential trigger opens up the unsettling possibility that our evolutionary history was shaped by random geological events. It underscores the role of contingency and chance in the history of life on Earth. Our existence is the product of a specific set of circumstances, a fragile chain of events that could have been easily broken. This realization connects our deep past to the future of other species, and even to the search for life on other planets. It suggests that intelligent life elsewhere might be rare, not because it doesn't evolve, but because it is incredibly vulnerable to planetary-scale catastrophes during its long and fragile adolescence. The investigation into humanity's greatest crisis is a collaborative detective story, uniting geneticists, paleoanthropologists, climatologists, geologists, and archaeologists. It is a reminder that science is not a static collection of facts, but a dynamic, self-correcting process of inquiry. The bottleneck hypothesis, while powerfully supported, is still a theory that must be tested and refined with every new discovery. The silent years of our ghost lineage are a challenge, an invitation to the next generation of scientists to dig deeper, to sequence more creatively, and to think more broadly. The story of how 99% of the ancient human population was wiped out is no longer a forgotten secret. It is a central, defining drama in our history, and the search for its full truth has only just begun. The ashes of that ancient catastrophe still hold many secrets, and each one we uncover teaches us not only about where we came from, but, perhaps more importantly, about what we are capable of surviving. The events of 900,000 years ago can feel impossibly remote, a dramatic but distant chapter in a history long since concluded. The world of our bottleneck ancestors, a world of megafauna, volatile climates, and a bare handful of humans, seems to have little in common with our modern existence of bustling cities, global networks, and technological dominance. Yet, the legacy of that near extinction is not confined to textbooks or the double helix of our DNA. It resonates in the challenges we face today, offering profound insights, stark warnings, and a surprising source of hope for our future. The most immediate parallel lies in the realm of climate change. Our ancestors were pushed to the brink by a dramatic shift in the global climate, a shift characterized by increased aridity, volatile weather patterns, and the collapse of reliable ecosystems. Today, humanity is the architect of another great climatic shift, one that is unfolding with breathtaking speed. The lesson from the bottleneck is unequivocal. Climate change is not an abstract environmental concern. It is an existential threat capable of destabilizing the foundations of civilization. The ancient event shows us how vulnerable human populations are to disruptions in food and water security, how easily established migration routes and hunting grounds can vanish, and how quickly a widespread species can be fragmented and isolated. It is a prehistoric case study in systemic collapse, urging us to recognize the fragility of the systems upon which we depend. Our ancestors had no warning and no control over their changing world. We have both. Their experience is a clarion call to action, emphasizing that adaptation and resilience are not theoretical concepts but the essential ingredients for survival. This history also sheds light on the persistent challenges of genetic disease. The high prevalence of certain inherited disorders in modern humans is a direct consequence of our genetically homogeneous origins. This understanding fuels the urgent work of geneticists and medical researchers. By tracing the origins and pathways of these mutations back to the bottleneck, science can develop better screening methods, more targeted therapies, and a deeper comprehension of our shared biological vulnerability. It transforms these diseases from random misfortunes into part of our historical narrative, a narrative that modern medicine is now striving to rewrite. On a societal level, the bottleneck story reinforces the paramount importance of cooperation and global interconnection. The survivors endured because they perfected the art of working together in small, intensely cooperative groups. In our modern globalized world, the definition of the group has expanded to encompass the entire planet. The challenges we face, pandemics, climate change, resource depletion, are global in scale and cannot be solved by isolated nations or competing factions. The lesson from our ancestors is that our greatest strength is our ability to collaborate, to share knowledge and resources, and to act for the common good. The social bonds that were forged in the crucible of that long winter are the same bonds we must rely on now to navigate an increasingly complex future. Their story is a powerful argument against isolationism and conflict, demonstrating that unity and shared purpose are not just ideals but practical necessities for survival. Furthermore, this deep history can serve as a source of humility and perspective. In an age often characterized by human arrogance and a belief in our separation from nature, the bottleneck reminds us of our true place in the world. We are not the masters of the planet, but one species among millions, subject to the same geological and climatic forces that have shaped life for billions of years. Our existence is the result of chance, resilience, and a fortunate alignment of circumstances. This realization can foster a greater sense of stewardship and responsibility for the biosphere that sustains us, and a deeper appreciation for the incredible, against-all-odds journey that led to our existence. Finally, the story of the bottleneck is ultimately one of hope. It is the definitive proof of human resilience. We are the descendants of the ultimate survivors, of those who refused to vanish. They endured a 100,000-year winter through ingenuity, adaptability, and sheer force of social will. This is our inheritance. When we confront the immense problems of the modern world, we do so not as a fragile species, but as one tempered in the fires of catastrophe. The same capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to care for one another that allowed a tiny band in southern Africa to persevere is alive in us today. It is encoded in our cultures, our institutions, and our shared humanity. The echo of the bottleneck is a sound that has traveled for nearly 1 million years to reach us. It is a warning whisper about vulnerability and a triumphant shout about endurance. It tells us that we have been to the brink before and have returned. As we face an uncertain future, we would do well to listen to this ancient echo, to remember the long winter, and to trust in the indomitable spirit that carried us through it. Our past is not a separate country. It is the foundation of our present and the guide for our future. The story of how 99% of humanity was wiped out is not just a tale of loss. It is, in the end, the story of why we are still here. As we draw this narrative to a close, we are left not with a simple conclusion, but with a profound and complex tapestry. The story of the population bottleneck 900,000 years ago is not a linear tale of disaster and recovery. It is a multifaceted saga that intertwines geology, genetics, climate science, archaeology, and the intangible spirit of humanity itself. To look back on this event is to see the threads of catastrophe and resilience woven together into the very fabric of what we are. We began with a mystery hidden in our genes, a ghost of demographics past, revealed by the brilliant detective work of modern science. This discovery shattered the old, comfortable narrative of steady human progress, replacing it with something far more dramatic and truthful. A story of catastrophic collapse, a brush with oblivion, so close that it left a permanent scarred signature in every cell of our bodies. We followed the evidence to a world in turmoil, a planet transitioning into a deeper, more volatile ice age, where expanding deserts and vanishing water sources fractured the home of our ancestors. We explored the terrifying possibility of a perfect storm, where long-term climatic trends converged with a potential supervolcanic eruption to create an apocalypse that pushed a successful, widespread species to the very edge of extinction. We imagined the long winter that followed over 100,000 years of isolation, scarcity, and cultural amnesia, where our forebears were reduced to a tiny, vulnerable band clinging to survival in a refuge. Their world shrunk to a desperate daily struggle for food and water. Yet, within that struggle, we found the seeds of our greatest strengths. The intense pressure forged tighter social bonds, selected for unparalleled cooperation, and rewarded cognitive flexibility and ingenuity. The survivors were not the strongest, but the most adaptable. Not the most aggressive, but the most cooperative. They emerged from their refuge, not as conquerors, but as inheritors of an empty world. And they began the great work of repopulation, armed with new technologies like the mastery of fire and refined tool-making techniques. This journey left us with a dual legacy, a genetic vulnerability that makes us susceptible to disease, but also a profound capacity for resilience, empathy, and innovation. It is a paradoxical inheritance of both fragility and mighty strength, born from the same catastrophic event. This history humbles us, reminding us that we are part of the natural world, subject to its immense forces, and that our existence is a contingent gift, not a destined right. But most importantly, this story connects our deepest past to our present and future in the most urgent of ways. It serves as a stark warning of the existential threat posed by climate change and ecological collapse. Lessons written in the ancient rocks and ashes of a world that nearly lost us. It underscores the critical importance of global cooperation, of nurturing the social bonds that have always been our primary survival tool. And it provides a deep wellspring of hope. The tapestry of us is still being woven. The threads of new scientific discoveries, of our response to modern challenges, of our efforts to build a better future, are all being added to this ancient loom. The story of the bottleneck is not a closed book. It is a foundational chapter that informs every subsequent one. It teaches us that endings can be followed by new beginnings, that collapse can give way to renewal, and that from the deepest winter, a spring can eventually emerge. We are the echo of that long-lost struggle. Our languages, our cultures, our art, our science, and our compassion are all monuments to those who endured. We carry their legacy forward, not just in our DNA, but in our every effort to overcome adversity, to understand our world, and to care for one another. The silence that nearly fell over the world was broken by the determined voices of a few, and those voices have multiplied into a chorus of billions. We are the proof of their survival. We are the meaning of their struggle. And in remembering their story, we honor them, and we reaffirm our own commitment to persevere. The story of the great bottleneck does not truly end. It reverberates through time, a fundamental chord in the song of our species. To stand now in the modern world, and to look back across that vast chasm of nearly 1 million years, is to engage in an act of profound time travel, not of the body but of the mind and spirit. We are the end product of that ancient struggle, and in understanding it, we come to understand something essential about ourselves. Every human society, in every corner of the globe, tells stories of a great flood, a devastating winter, or a world-ending catastrophe from which only a handful of survivors emerged to repopulate the earth. These myths, found in cultures with no possible historical connection to one another, have long puzzled scholars. Could they be a distant, fragmented, cultural memory of a real event? While we can never know for certain, the genetic evidence of the bottleneck provides a tantalizing possibility. The trauma was so deep, the reduction so severe, that it may have etched itself into our collective subconscious, emerging generations later in the universal language of myth and story. The tale of Noah's Ark of Deucalion and Pyrrha throwing the bones of their mother, the stones of the earth, to repopulate the world. Of the countless other deluge myths, they all speak of an end and a fragile, hopeful new beginning. They are the echo of the echo, a whisper of a time when the world grew dark and cold, and humanity was reduced to a precious few. The scientific journey to uncover this event is itself a testament to the very ingenuity that ensured our survival. The same cognitive flexibility that allowed our ancestors to shift from hunting megafauna to foraging for shellfish now allows us to sequence genomes and model ancient climates. The same cooperation that bound that small band together now binds a global community of scientists, sharing data and insights across borders to piece together our shared history. The story of the bottleneck is, therefore, a story about the power of story itself, the human drive to seek our origins, to understand our place in the cosmos, and to find meaning in the patterns of the past. As we move forward into an uncertain future, facing challenges of our own making, this deep history offers a final, crucial lesson: the importance of memory. Forgetting the bottleneck, forgetting how close we came to vanishing, would be a catastrophic amnesia. It would allow us to believe in the illusion of our invulnerability, to ignore the fragility of the systems that sustain us, and to undervalue the cooperation that is our greatest asset. Remembering it grounds us. It reminds us that we are part of the natural world, subject to its immense and powerful forces. It reinforces the absolute necessity of stewardship of our planet, of its resources, and of each other. The long winter of our species is over. The descendants of those few survivors have now walked on the moon, sequenced their own genome, and peered to the edge of the observable universe. We have created art, literature, and music of breathtaking beauty. We have built civilizations and sought to understand the very laws of nature. This incredible flourishing is the ultimate monument to the resilience of that tiny band, their will to live, their ability to adapt, and their capacity to hope against all odds were the seeds from which the modern world grew. So, the next time you look up at the night sky, or stand in a crowded street, or simply clasp the hand of another person, remember that you carry within you a genetic memory of that survival. You are the inheritor of a resilience forged in the hardest of fires. You are the living proof that an ending can be a beginning in disguise. The whisper of those ancient bones is not a whisper of loss. It is a whisper of triumph. It is the sound of a species that stared into the abyss and, against all probability, endured. And it is a reminder that as long as we remember that strength and continue to nurture the bonds that hold us together, our story is far from over. In fact, one might say, it has only just begun. The discovery of the population bottleneck has provided a stunning new framework for understanding human evolution. But like all great scientific revelations, it opens doors to even more complex and challenging questions. While the evidence for the event itself grows stronger, the precise mechanisms and its full implications remain a fertile ground for investigation, speculation, and even philosophical inquiry. Beyond the established theories of climate and catastrophe lie alternative ideas and speculative frontiers that push the boundaries of our understanding of this profound chapter in our history. One compelling, though highly speculative, theory moves beyond terrestrial causes to consider an extraterrestrial trigger. Could the bottleneck have been caused by the cataclysmic impact of a large asteroid or comet? We know such an event was responsible for the extinction of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, and a similar impact, around 900 years ago, would have had devastating global consequences, unleashing firestorms, triggering an impact winter by lofting vast amounts of debris into the atmosphere and causing widespread ecological collapse. While no crater of the appropriate size and age has been definitively linked to this period, the geological record is imperfect, and an impact in the deep ocean or onto glacial ice could have left a faint and difficult-to-detect signature. The search for evidence, such as microspherules or unusual concentrations of iridium in sediment layers from this time, continues, driven by the knowledge that our planet exists in a cosmic shooting gallery, and that our history has been shaped by such random, violent events. Another fascinating area of speculation revolves around the possibility of a pandemic. Could a hypervirulent pathogen have swept through the global hominin population? In a world without modern medicine, where groups were isolated and had no acquired immunity, a novel and deadly virus or bacterium could have spread with terrifying speed, devastating group after group. This theory is incredibly difficult to prove or disprove, as viruses leave no fossil record, and ancient bacterial DNA is rarely recovered from such old contexts. However, the genetic bottleneck itself could be seen as indirect evidence. A pandemic would act as a powerful selective filter, and the survivors would have been those with natural genetic immunities or resistances, which would then have been passed on and become widespread in the descendant population. Our modern immune systems may carry the legacy of this ancient plague, a silent memory of a battle fought and won against an invisible foe a million years ago. The psychological and neurological impact of the bottleneck is another profound frontier. Did this extended period of extreme stress and social intensity catalyze a leap in human consciousness? Some theorists propose that the necessity of understanding the intentions of your few companions with perfect clarity of planning for an uncertain future, of communicating complex ideas about scarce resources and imminent dangers, placed unprecedented selective pressure on the brain. This pressure, they argue, could have accelerated the development of the prefrontal cortex and the neural pathways associated with what we call theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others. In essence, the need to survive may have forced us to become more empathetic, more intuitive, and more deeply social. The bottleneck, in this view, was not just a demographic event, but a cognitive one. The crucible in which the modern human mind, with its profound capacity for introspection, imagination, and shared intentionality, was finally forged. Furthermore, this event forces us to confront profound philosophical questions about humanity's place in the universe. The bottleneck underscores the role of contingency, of chance, and accidentine evolution. Our existence is not the product of a predetermined, progressive march toward complexity and intelligence. It is the result of a specific and precarious set of circumstances. If that small group in southern Africa had succumbed to a localized drought or a predator attack, the entire trajectory of life on Earth would be different. Intelligence, self-awareness, and culture as we know it might never have evolved again. This realization is both humbling and exhilarating. It suggests that we are not the center of the universe, but it also highlights the incredible, fragile wonder of our existence. We are a fluke, a happy accident, the product of a million random chances that somehow, against all odds, aligned in our favor. The search for answers continues. Every new archaeological dig, every advance in genetic sequencing technology, every refined climate model brings us closer to understanding the true nature of our greatest crisis. The ghosts of that forgotten time, the lost populations, the vanished cultures, the causes of the collapse, slowly being coaxed from the shadows. This journey of discovery is a testament to our unquenchable curiosity, the very trait that may have been honed in the long winter. We are driven to understand our past, not just for the sake of knowledge, but because in that understanding, we find clues to our own nature, our vulnerabilities, and our astounding capacity for resilience. The story of the bottleneck is, therefore, never-ending. It is a story we are still unraveling, a mystery that continues to shape not only our view of the past, but also our vision for the future.